At the beginning of the 18th century, what is today the Trans-Mississippi United States consisted of three political regions, each controlled by a foreign power. By early in the 20th century, those areas were part of the United States and were broken into 22 political divisions, with the borders being essentially as they are today. The changes that occurred over that time are fascinating and are the subject of our Shaping the American West series of YouTube lectures. Period maps provide a unique perspective on this topic, for they show us the political situation in the country in, as it were, real time, as the borders were drawn and redrawn, even when the borders lasted for just a short time. And interestingly, we will find that contemporary maps sometimes also show borders that never were officially created. These lectures will look at the Shaping the American West using original maps from the period to help illustrate this complex subject. As we saw in the previous lecture in this series, with the Compromise of 1850 and the subsequent Kansas-Nebraska Act, by 1860, the Trans-Mississippi West was almost completely divided into either states or organized territories. There were 8 states, including Oregon, California, and Texas, and the 5 states lining the western bank of the Mississippi River. There were 5 quite large territories and 2 smaller unorganized territories, Dakota and the Indian Territory. At that time, there was a pent-up demand by the burgeoning populations in the various parts of the West to break up the larger territories into states and smaller territories, so the residents could have more local control of their own affairs. For instance, the New York Times reported on January 11, 1859, that there were 6 applications for new territories pending before Congress. However, new territories or states were blocked by the slavery issue, for the big question was whether the new territories and states would be slave or free, and the political developments of the 1850s had acerbated the already tense standoff between Southerners and Northerners. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had, in theory, prohibited new slave states or territories north of the 36-degree 30-minute latitude line, but this had been abrogated by the policy of popular sovereignty adopted in the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. As a result, almost no new political developments happened in the American West between 1854 and 1860. However, in early 1861, the dynamic totally changed with the secession of all the Confederate states. When Southern congressmen from the seceding states left Congress, all of a sudden the now heavily Northern and anti-slavery legislature could create new territories and states as they desired. Within the first 3 months of 1861, 3 new territories were created. One of these territories was in the Northern Plains. As we saw in the last lecture, in 1858, what had been the eastern part of Minnesota Territory became a state, and the rest of the old territory was left as an unorganized territory called Dakota. In 1861, Dakota was made an official territory, but significantly expanded so as to include what had been the Nebraska Territory north of the 43rd parallel. The other 2 new territories were created in the Southwest, taking large chunks from the Utah Territory. In 1859, the Comstock lode was discovered in western Utah, leading to a silver rush in the area. Most of the new population was from California or the East, and they were generally opposed to the Mormons who had controlled the Utah government, so they wanted to create a new territory out of western Utah. This was viewed favorably by Congress, which was anti-Mormon, anti-slavery, and wanted closer control of mineral resources. Thus, Nevada was created out of western Utah in March 1861. Similar reasons had led to the creation of the Colorado Territory earlier that year. The impetus for this came from the Pikes Peak gold rush. In 1858, gold was discovered where Denver is located today, and in the next year or so, thousands of people looking to get rich settled along the Front Range in what was then the western part of Kansas Territory. These settlers felt distant from the Kansas territorial government in the far eastern part of the territory, and they wanted a local government. Also, those in eastern Kansas were afraid the booming population on the Front Range would grow so large that the Pikes Peakers might begin to outvote them. In 1859, a bill was introduced in Congress to organize the territory of Colona along the Front Range out of the western parts of Nebraska and Kansas. Colona was never created, however, mostly because of the slavery issue, for this was before the Southerners had seceded. Later, in 1859, another group petitioned Congress to create a Jefferson Territory, essentially in the same area. In this case, a provisional government was established, complete with a constitution, governor, and legislature. The government operated for about 2 years, but again, it was never authorized. Finally, once the Southerners left Congress, Colorado was created on February 28, 1861. This resulted from the desire of Congress to have another free territory, one in which they could control the mineral wealth, and to keep the region out of the Confederacy. Colorado was created mostly from western Kansas, southwestern Nebraska, the northern part of New Mexico, and a large swath from the Mormons, Utah. The territory was named Colorado instead of Jefferson, for at that time Thomas Jefferson was unpopular as a Southerner. There was one more possible new territory which was under discussion just before the Civil War. The New Mexico Territory had been created to the south of Utah in 1850. In 1854, the Gadsden Purchase added about 30,000 square miles to the original acquisition from Mexico, south of the Gila and west of the Rio Grande. This was added primarily because of the desire to run a transcontinental railroad along the southern part of the country. The southern part of the New Mexico Territory was settled mostly by Southerners and was called either Gadsdonia or Arizona. There was considerable dissatisfaction with the political setup among the settlers in this area. Most of the previous inhabitants of New Mexico were Spanish and they were located in the north. Those in the southern part felt neglected. Also, the northern part of the territory was anti-slavery, while the southern part was settled mostly by those from slave states. Thus, there was a movement to establish a new territory of Arizona in the southern part of the New Mexico Territory, below the 34th parallel. In 1856 and 1860, conventions were held in the South to create a territory of Arizona. The 1860 conventions actually elected a governor and sent a delegation to Congress. The Northerners in Congress, however, refused to go along with the territory because it was below the old Missouri Compromise line and so would be a slave territory. This map is an example of where a mapmaker, in this case Johnson and Browning, expected Congress to pass legislation creating this southern Arizona territory, so they added it to their map even before it was officially established. To their subsequent chagrin, the territory was never officially created, leaving this an erroneous map. However, while embarrassments for the publishers at the time, maps like this are very popular today with collectors. Another interesting thing to note on this map is that it was issued just after Nevada was created, so Johnson and Browning added the new border and name, but didn't bother to correct the old Utah name, which is shown in both Utah and Nevada. Not happy with not having a new territory created for them by Congress, when the Confederacy was created in 1861, Arizonians voted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. Subsequently, Confederate troops from Texas came into the territory in support of this breakaway territory. At first, the Confederates were successful, but at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, the Confederate Army was forced to retreat back to Texas. The Arizona territorial government never again had any real power, but they were represented in the Confederate Congress, and troops fought under its flag for the rest of the Civil War. Despite Congress's not wanting to accept the Arizona Territory as proposed, it was obvious that the New Mexico Territory was too big and needed to be divided. So in 1863, Arizona Territory was created by Congress, but they made the border run north-south rather than east-west, to preclude the de facto recognition of the Confederate territory and the formation of a new slave state. In the spring of 1861, the country had fallen into a dark period of civil war. However, most of the military action took place in the East, whereas much of the action in the West in the Civil War years related to mining. As the earlier gold and silver rushes had led to the formation of Nevada and Colorado, the new mineral discoveries also resulted in the creation of new borders. Nevada had been created in early 1861 as a result of the Comstock lode discovery. Further, nearby mineral discoveries led to the modification to that territory's borders. Nevada was considerably more popular in Congress than Mormon Utah. So, when in 1862 gold was discovered in the western part of Utah, Congress decided to move the border of Nevada 1 degree of longitude east from the 116th to 115th meridian. This had the result of taking land and its minerals from Utah and giving it to Nevada. Note how the border now touches the U in the Utah. The reduction of Utah's territory continued, for more gold was discovered shortly thereafter, and in 1864 the border was again moved 1 degree further east, now to the 114th meridian, so the new mineral lands would be part of Nevada and not Utah. The congressional bias toward Nevada and against Utah is further evidenced by noting that Nevada achieved statehood in 1864, only 3 years after it became a territory, whereas Utah, a territory as early as 1850, did not become a state until 1896. This last map also shows that Nevada was a beneficiary of another congressional bias. In 1867, Nevada's southern border, which had been at the 37th parallel, was moved south to give the state access to the Colorado River. This took land away from Arizona. Payback against Arizona may have had something to do with this. Besides these border modifications in the Southwest, there were other border changes during the Civil War in the Northwest. As we saw in the previous lecture, Oregon was created as a state in 1859, with the eastern part of the old Oregon Territory becoming attached to Washington Territory, creating an inverted L shape. Beginning in 1860, there were a series of discoveries of gold in the eastern part of Washington Territory. This created similar pressures to create a new territory to those we saw in relation to Nevada and Colorado. The miners wanted local control, and those in western Washington were worried about political power being taken away by the growing population in the gold field. As it happens, Congress had earlier considered creating a new territory out of the area to the east of the state of Oregon. One proposal was for a territory of Shoshone, but the deadlock over slavery meant that this territory was never created. Here we can see another example where a publisher added a never created territory to his maps. With the new gold strikes in the area, the idea of creating a new territory was again raised in the post-secession Congress, this time for a proposed territory to be called Idaho. The name Idaho actually has an interesting history. The word first appeared in 1860 as a possible name of the territory being contemplated along the Front Range. It had been put forward by one George M. Willing, who said it was an Indian word meaning gem of the mountains. However, it turns out it was simply a word made up by Willing, and when this was discovered, Colorado was chosen as the name of the new territory instead. When a new territory was under discussion a few years later, the deceitful origin of the name was forgotten. The name had become common in popular usage in the Northwest, and so it was selected for the name of the new territory. In any case, in 1863, Idaho Territory was created, but not in the shape originally planned. Instead, Washington Territory was truncated, so its eastern border ran pretty much north from the Oregon border. All the lands to the east were put into the new territory of Idaho. This map from 1863 shows how map publishers were always scrambling to try to keep up with the changing borders in the American West. The map came out just after Idaho's creation, and the publisher reused his previous lithographic stone of the area, but updated it by adding new borders and modifying the coloring. He also changed the lettering to fit the name Washington into the newly reduced territory, but at the same time didn't remove the tail end of the old name, now running into the new territory. He also only had space to fit the name of the new territory in very small letters. Another error on this map, which bespeaks the haste with which it was published, is the continued appearance of the name Dakota Territory just to the east of the Rockies. This is an error because when Idaho Territory was created, it didn't just include the eastern part of the old Washington Territory, but actually extended all the way east to the 104th longitudinal line, taking land from both the old Dakota Territory and the Nebraska Territory. This created an unwieldy, very large territory, which for practical purposes needed to be broken into smaller units. The desire to break up this large territory was strengthened by gold discoveries in 1862 on the east side of the rugged Bitterroot Mountains. Like in the previous cases, these miners wanted their own territory, feeling especially cut off by the Bitterroot Mountains from the Idaho government. As a result, just a year later in 1864, the northeastern part of the Idaho Territory was separated off to create the Montana Territory. It is interesting to look at where the border between Montana and Idaho was drawn. The original border in the area between Washington Territory and Dakota Territory was along the Continental Divide. However, the 1864 border between Idaho and Montana followed the Bitterroot Range to the west. Popular legend says this is the result of a drunken survey team which followed the wrong mountain range. However, the real reason was because of the lobbying of the miners in Montana and one Sidney Egerton. Egerton was a friend of Abraham Lincoln who had been sent out to keep an eye on things in the newly created Idaho Territory. He got peeved off at that governor and so took the side of the Montana miners, and so Montana got more land. One interesting result of the creation of the Montana Territory out of the northeastern part of the huge Idaho Territory is that the lands to the south, which had been part of southeastern Idaho, was now given back to the Dakota Territory. That territory now took on this unusual butterfly shape. This impractical shape, plus the very large size of Dakota, made it inevitable that it would soon be broken up into smaller territories. This, though, did not happen until after the Civil War, and so will be considered in our next lecture. In any case, to summarize, we have seen how the secession of Southern congressmen allowed the U.S. government to establish 3 new territories in 1861. In the years following, during the Civil War, economic forces not directly related to that conflict, in particular gold and silver rushes, led to more border modifications, including the creation of 2 further territories. At the end of the war, the Western United States had taken on internal borders which look familiar to us, except in the north-central part of the region. How the final changes to the shape of the western borders took place will be the subject of the final part of our Shaping the American West series of YouTube lectures. Thank you for viewing this lecture about the changing American West during the Civil War years. We hope you found it enjoyable and informative. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch. If you would like to see a selection of original antique maps, please visit our website at pps-west.com.